Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida al webinar Salvaguardias nucleares en América Latina y el Caribe, retos y oportunidades para la no proliferación y seguridad física nuclear, organizado por la Secretaría del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, particularmente desde la sección de desarme y no proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva. Mi nombre es Daniela Ramírez Castillo y soy oficial de programas en esta sección y tendré el gusto de moderar esta sesión. Antes de comenzar, quisiera agradecer muy especialmente la participación de los representantes de los Estados miembros de la OEA, funcionarios gubernamentales, autoridades técnicas, representantes de organismos internacionales, academia y los demás participantes, el público en general, que nos acompañan el día de hoy de manera virtual. Este webinar tendrá una duración aproximada de 1 hora. Contaremos primero con unas palabras de apertura, seguidas de la presentación principal a cargo de nuestro experto invitado, y al final tendremos un espacio para preguntas y respuestas. Les recordamos que pueden enviar sus preguntas a través del chat o en la función de preguntas y respuestas de la plataforma en cualquier momento durante la presentación. Al finalizar la intervención del expositor, recogeremos algunas de ellas para compartirlas con el experto. También les recordamos que esta sesión cuenta con interpretación en inglés, por lo que pueden seleccionar el canal de su idioma de preferencia en la plataforma. Bueno, y el tema que nos convoca hoy es de particular relevancia para nuestra región. Las salvaguardias nucleares constituyen uno de los pilares fundamentales del régimen internacional de no proliferación. A través de ellas, la comunidad internacional cuenta con un sistema de verificación que busca asegurar que los materiales y actividades nucleares se utilicen exclusivamente para fines pacíficos. En América Latina y el Caribe, esta discusión adquiere una importancia especial. Nuestra región cuenta con una larga tradición de compromisos para el desarme y la no proliferación nuclear, reflejada de manera destacada en el Tratado de Tlatelolco, que estableció la primera zona libre de armas nucleares en una región densamente poblada del mundo. Al mismo tiempo, varios países de la región continúan explorando el desarrollo de programas de energía nuclear, por lo que comprender el sistema internacional de salvaguardias nucleares, sus bases jurídicas, sus requisitos técnicos y su relación con la seguridad nuclear resulta esencial en este momento del proceso. Es por ello que este webinar busca ofrecer una visión clara y accesible sobre estos temas, así como fomentar un diálogo informado sobre los retos, oportunidades y buenas prácticas en la implementación de las salvaguardias nucleares en nuestra región. Para dar inicio formal a esta sesión, tengo el honor de invitar al señor Guillermo Moncayo, secretario ejecutivo del Comité Interamericano contra el Terrorismo, para ofrecer unas palabras de apertura. Señor Moncayo, tiene usted la palabra.
Gracias, Daniela, y me uno a los saludos que mencionara Daniela al inicio. Buenos días a todos. Es un placer para mí darles la bienvenida a este tercer encuentro virtual del ciclo de webinars organizados por la sección de desarme y no proliferación de la Secretaría del SICTE, como lo mencionara Daniela al principio. Estos webinars, los cuales, como mencionáramos, están dedicados a analizar algunos de los desafíos y oportunidades más relevantes en materia de seguridad internacional y de no proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva en el contexto actual. A lo largo de este ciclo hemos tenido la oportunidad de abordar temas de creciente importancia estratégica, incluyendo el impacto de las tecnologías emergentes como la nanotecnología y la inteligencia artificial, así como el papel crucial de los minerales críticos en las cadenas de suministro y en la competitividad regional de América Latina. Estos temas también reflejan una realidad cada vez más evidente. Los desafíos contemporáneos a la seguridad internacional son complejos, transversales y evolucionan rápidamente. Por ello, resulta fundamental generar espacios de diálogo que permitan acercar estos asuntos a distintos públicos, fortalecer la comprensión común y promover la cooperación entre gobiernos, organismos internacionales, academia, sector técnico y nuevas generaciones de profesionales. En esta ocasión, nos reunimos para conversar sobre un tema fundamental dentro del régimen internacional de no proliferación: las salvaguardias nucleares y su importancia para aquellos países interesados en desarrollar, fortalecer o explorar programas de energía nuclear. La tecnología nuclear tiene aplicaciones muy valiosas para el desarrollo de nuestras sociedades. Sus usos pacíficos contribuyen en áreas como la salud, la agricultura, la investigación científica, la industria, la energía y la protección ambiental. Sin embargo, para que estos beneficios puedan aprovecharse de manera segura, responsable y transparente, es indispensable contar con marcos institucionales y mecanismos de verificación sólidos. En ese sentido, las salvaguardias nucleares cumplen un papel esencial. No solo permiten brindar confianza sobre el uso exclusivamente pacífico de los materiales y actividades nucleares, sino que también fortalecen la transparencia, la cooperación internacional y el cumplimiento de los compromisos asumidos por los estados en materia de no proliferación. Para América Latina y el Caribe, esta conversación tiene una importancia particular. Nuestra región cuenta con una reconocida tradición de compromiso con el desarme nuclear, reflejada de manera ejemplar en el Tratado de Tlatelolco, como en 1967 estableció la primera zona libre de armas nucleares en una región densamente poblada. Ese legado regional constituye un motivo de orgullo, pero también una responsabilidad compartida para seguir promoviendo el uso pacífico, seguro y responsable de la tecnología nuclear. Desde SICTE entendemos que la no proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva es un elemento clave de la seguridad hemisférica. Por ello, continuamos impulsando espacios de diálogo, sensibilización y cooperación técnica que contribuyan a fortalecer las capacidades de los Estados miembros y a promover una mejor comprensión de los instrumentos, mecanismos y buenas prácticas disponibles en esta materia. Quisiera extender mi más sincero agradecimiento al señor Noah Mayhew, investigador asociado del Centro de Viena para el Desarme y la No Proliferación, conocido como los voy a leer en inglés, BCNDP, que se conecta desde Viena para su tiempo y disposición en compartir sus conocimientos en este tema. Este tema es altamente técnico y traducirlos a una manera que pueda ser entendida a una audiencia diversa. También agradezco a todas las personas que se han conectado el día de hoy, representantes gubernamentales, diplomáticos, estudiantes, académicos, especialistas técnicos y público interesado. Su participación refleja el interés creciente que existe en nuestra región por comprender mejor los vínculos entre ciencia, seguridad, desarrollo sostenible y cooperación internacional. Esperamos que esta sesión sea clara, sea también útil y enriquecedora, tanto para quienes trabajan directamente en estos temas como para quienes se acercan a ellos por primera vez. Y con estas palabras damos inicio a este webinar. Daniela, muchas gracias. Te paso la palabra.
Muchas gracias, señor Moncayo, por sus palabras y por resaltar la importancia de continuar fortaleciendo la cooperación hemisférica en materia de no proliferación y seguridad nuclear. A continuación, tendremos la presentación principal de este webinar, orientada a explicar de manera clara qué son las salvaguardias nucleares, por qué son importantes, cuál es su estado de implementación en América Latina y el Caribe, y cuáles son algunos de los principales desafíos y oportunidades para los estados de la región. Como lo mencionamos ya, nos acompaña el señor Noah Mayhew, que es investigador asociado del Centro de Viena para el Desarme y la No Proliferación. El señor Mayhew se incorporó al VCDNP en julio de 2018 con un enfoque en la no proliferación nuclear, las salvaguardias nucleares internacionales y la verificación nuclear, el control de armas nucleares y la relación entre Estados Unidos y Rusia. Desde su incorporación, el señor Mayhew ha trabajado extensamente en asuntos relacionados con las salvaguardias, incluyendo el concepto de salvaguardias a nivel estatal, actividades de divulgación y fortalecimiento de capacidades en materia de salvaguardias, propulsión nuclear naval, entre otros temas. También ha trabajado en control de armas entre Estados Unidos y Rusia, incluyendo en temas de verificación y monitoreo. También ha contribuido a un proyecto en curso del VCDNP sobre el nexo entre la seguridad nuclear y los usos pacíficos de la ciencia y la tecnología nuclear. Además de su agenda de investigación muy extensiva, el señor Mayhew dirige los cursos insignia del VCDNP para diplomáticos y profesionales del ámbito nuclear, así como en cursos especializados ad hoc sobre las salvaguardias. El señor Mayhew cuenta con estudios de posgrado de no proliferación del Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey y del Instituto Estatal de Relaciones Internacionales de Moscú, por sus siglas en inglés MGIMO, donde abordó la política estadounidense soviética y estadounidense rusa con respecto al programa nuclear de Corea del Norte. El señor Mayhew habla inglés, ruso y alemán. Señor Mayhew, gracias por acompañarnos. Tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you so much for what sounded like a very kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen just now. And if you could just nod that that is visible, that would be appreciated.
It's working.
And fantastic. So I think the best kinds of these talks are not, the best kind of these seminars are a story. And so what I would like to do today is to tell you a story about how it is that we, as the human race, discovered what nuclear energy can do, and how it is that we decide to govern it based on the threats that we perceive from it. So you're all familiar with the story. 1945, the United States conducts the first atomic bombings on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first, and let us hope, the last ever use of nuclear weapons in war. And that woke the international community up. There was this immediate question of what do we do with this technology? This technology which has the equal propensity, the equal ability to provide such advancements in development through healthcare, through electricity generation, and many of these other applications, but also could destroy the human race, could destroy the world. Very immediately, we start grappling with this question of international control of atomic energy. And the first mention of what we now call safeguards was in this 1945 declaration that the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada made on atomic energy. This called for effective, reciprocal, and enforceable safeguards acceptable to all nations. But there was the immediate understanding that by themselves, what would that mean? And we really didn't know at first, but we knew we needed some kind of safeguard, some kind of protections. The year following, the very first United Nations General Assembly resolution comes out, and the subject is on what to do with atomic energy. So now on the term safeguards, we get more specific. We've established the UN Atomic Energy Commission. And in the terms of reference for the commission, one of the things that they were supposed to do is to make proposals for effective safeguards by way of inspection. Okay, so now we know the how. Safeguards work through inspections. Now, fun fact, inspections were also considered at the time to be potentially not enough, but we'll get there in a moment. So the UN Atomic Energy Commission works for a while, from 1946 up until 1949, but then the Soviet Union tested. So what had been 3 years of debate about where could the inspectors go, what kind of measurements could they take, what nationalities could the inspectors be from, right? Because you don't want your country's inspectors inspecting your own facilities if the goal is international cooperation. That all goes until 1949. The Soviet Union tests, and then basically the Atomic Energy Commission is a empty meeting room until it's finally officially dissolved in 1952. But not to worry. 1953, we have the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is a World War II hero. And he makes a speech at the United Nations General Assembly called the Atoms for Peace speech that I'm sure you've heard about in the past. And in the Atoms for Peace speech, Eisenhower calls for the establishment of an international atomic energy agency to spread peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology throughout the world, but there's still this idea of safeguard. They spend 4 years negotiating the statute of the agency. It's founded in 1957, and it comes with this dual mandate. One, like I said, peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology have many applications for development. lots of peaceful uses, and they should be spread for the betterment of the entire world, but military uses. And so statute includes some specific language on the need for safeguards to ensure that nuclear technology is not used to further military purposes. We'll come back to that because that's not quite how safeguards work today, but that was the idea, this two sides of the coin. But the statute is what gives the IAEA the authority to do what it does today. It is not a specific agreement with your country on the application of safeguards. You need specific safeguards agreements. Now, I talk about that just in a moment, but through the rest of this presentation, as we think about how safeguards have evolved, there's something that I want you to keep in mind. And I'm going to steal this quote from Laura Rockwood, also informally known as the Queen of Safeguards. She has a theory. Laura says that the non-proliferation regime and IAEA safeguards in particular have evolved as a function of state security needs and states' perceptions of the risks thereto. Now, in plain language, that means what are you concerned about? What are your fears when it comes to nuclear weapons? And how can safeguards help to alleviate those fears? And that's how it's evolved basically the entire time, based on different challenges that have come up in the international community. And that's what we'll talk about. Now, the challenge in the very early days of safeguards, this is from the 1957 up through the mid to late 60s, is that I might supply you a reactor. But what if you use that technology to create a nuclear weapon? And so the early safeguards agreements were what were kind of called project and supply agreements. So I'll sell you this reactor, but you got to put it under safeguard. We call these kind of agreements now item-specific safeguards agreements. They were based on a couple of documents, INFCIRC 26, INFCIRC 66, and its revisions. Now, INFCIRC just means information circular. It's how the IAEA codes documents. So these documents defined sort of the different procedures that would be used for different kinds of facilities to ensure that facilities and material under safeguards were not used to manufacture nuclear weapons. But they only applied to the specific facilities, equipment, and materials that were named in the agreement. Now, as I'm sure you all know, there are much broader reaching comprehensive safeguards agreements now, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And these sort of took over, they superseded the item-specific agreements. There's only 3 of them that are still in force, and I have guess who on the screen, but I'll just say it. It's India, Pakistan, and Israel still have these in force. They never joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's the early days. Now, I am not an expert in nuclear weapon-free zones, but the other thing that happens around this time is we have the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which I believe was referenced in the introduction. Just to make a couple of quick points, it is the Treaty of Tlatelolco was concluded before the Non-Proliferation Treaty was open for signature. And it was prompted largely by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially, my understanding, the countries of the region saw the Cuban Missile Crisis taking place and basically said, not in my backyard, not again. And that's where the treaty came from. And this was the first large multilateral effort that involved a requirement of safeguards. And you see the formulation on the screen, which I just got from the text of the treaty. It requires in Article 13, multilateral or bilateral agreements with the agency for the application of safeguards to its nuclear activities. Now, I read that as what we think of today as comprehensive safeguards agreements. Everyone talks about that in relation to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You can pat yourself on the back. You guys thought of it first. So we then have the new challenge, the new perceived threat to global security. It shifts from what if I supply you something and you misuse it to what if you can have your own nuclear technology that you indigenously develop and then you use that to create nuclear weapons. There's this famous quote you see on the screen from John F. Kennedy, that whereas once the fear was, a little bit of proliferation, he was afraid that by 1970 that there could be 10 nuclear powers instead of at that time 4. And then by 1975, 15, 20. You hear in the literature this sort of avalanche of proliferation was the concern. And I have the Kennedy quote because it's a good quote. But he wasn't the only one concerned with that. So were the Soviets, and so were others. And this is what led to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in 1970. Now, the NPT crowd basically decided we're going to make the IAEA do the verification on this. And the IAEA is a technical body, but it is directed by its member states. Yeah, it's directed by countries. When the NPT entered into force and the IAEA had this new mandate, they did not want to be seen as interpreting what states parties to the NPT wanted. So when they established a committee of member states to negotiate what these safeguards agreements would look like, they just copied and pasted that language from the NPT, that these safeguards should cover all source or special fissionable material and all peaceful uses within the state, on the territory of the state, in its jurisdiction, or carried out under its control anywhere. That is the definition that you will see in the document IMPCIRC 153. This is document on the basis of which we have Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements, or CSAs, today. All of your countries, everyone on this call, has a Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. A couple of things about how these CSAs are implemented. For a long time, there was a practical focus on stuff that the state declared to the IAEA, right? Because the basic way that these agreements work is you conclude the agreement, you tell the agency where all of your facilities are, what the design is of those facilities, where all of your nuclear material is, and the agency comes and does inspections to verify that information. The focus on declared nuclear material and declared facilities is not anything that is written into the agreement. It was just deemed as enough, sufficient verification. And I'll get into the assumptions on that in a moment. But the other thing that went with IMPCIRC 153 were what are called small quantities protocols. And some of your governments have these. The idea at the time was that it doesn't really make sense to implement safeguards in a country with no nuclear activities in the same way that you would implement safeguards in a country with an extensive nuclear fuel cycle, right? And it was also a concern at the time that if they tried to do that, that new countries wouldn't join the NPT, right? Because it would be too much of a burden on the state to implement comprehensive safeguards. So we have these small quantities protocols that essentially suspended most of the reporting and inspection requirements under the agreement until such time as the country introduced nuclear material into a nuclear facility, or until such time as the country had a certain amount of nuclear material in the country as a whole. The problem with that was the IAEA had no way to verify that the country continued to qualify. Again, we come back to this later. But back to the comprehensive safeguards agreements themselves. They were based on 3 assumptions. The first was there was a lot of concern at the time about an inspector going places that they shouldn't go, an inspector gone mad, if you will, rather than a country concluding a legal agreement, which a safeguards agreement is a treaty, concluding this agreement only to then cheat on it. The other assumption was that small quantities, gram quantities of nuclear material, you can't really do much with that. So why should we be concerned about it? And the third assumption was that, a state really, if you wanted to have a secret nuclear weapons program, you couldn't really hide it. It would be too difficult. Well, my friends, all of those assumptions turned out to be false. We reached the 1990s. Iraq has a nuclear weapons program that that has been discovered by the international community, and the risk that we're thinking about shifts once more. The risk now is, the challenge that we need to face is, what if a state has not told you everything that it's got? What if it has undeclared material or activities that is contributing to a nuclear weapons program? How do we fix this? Well, in the very early 1990s, the IAEA's Board of Governors, one of its two governing bodies, makes a few decisions. Now, the 90s were a very busy time. Iraq was the largest driver, but we also have South Africa coming out and saying, we had 6.5 nuclear weapons. We don't have them anymore. Please come verify. We have North Korea and the anomalies in their declarations that came to light. So first couple of years, September of 1991, Board of Governors says, dear IAEA, please verify that everything that South Africa says is not just correct, but that those declarations are complete. There's nothing else. February, the following year, they reaffirmed the agency's right under special inspections to look at all nuclear material. We're not just talking about declared material. We're talking about the state as a whole. And this idea starts to take root. Following year, also in February, DPRK, North Korea, is now in the news. And the board asked the IAEA to verify both the correctness and the completeness of those declarations. Now, to give you an idea of why this correctness and completeness thing is so important, for years. Now, this is the Tuwaitha site in Iraq. This is I don't know, a couple of hours outside of Baghdad, I think. What you see on the screen are 3 facilities that the IAEA used to visit on a regular basis. They would come, they would inspect the things they were there to inspect, and then they would leave. This is what the IAEA thought was at the Tuwaitha site before 1991. This is all the stuff that they found after the clandestine nuclear weapons program was discovered. We're talking about activities that used what? Small quantities of nuclear material. We're talking about activities that were being conducted right under the nose of IAEA inspectors. They could hide it. And this sent the international community into a bit of, how shall I say, this raised the need for the international community to better address the problems associated with undeclared material and activities. So this is where we get the Model Additional Protocol. Now, if you're still with me on the document numbers, this is INFCIRC 540. It took a while for us to get there. After those initial decisions, the agency established Program 93+2. It was called that because it was 1993 and it had a 2-year mandate. And then it established a special committee of the board called Committee 24. And the whole goal of both of these was to figure out ways to strengthen safety. They identified some measures that could be implemented under existing authority, and then they identified other measures that they thought could benefit from additional legal authority for the IAEA. And this is what resulted in the Model Additional Protocol. I'll get into the specifics just now, but basically the Model Additional Protocol gives the IAEA more access to locations, more access to information, and it makes administrative procedures like multi-entry visas for inspectors, it makes that simpler. It is important to point out that this is additional to existing authority for things like unannounced inspections, access to undeclared locations, the verification of correctness and completeness. The agency could already do these things on a legal basis before the AP. It is only after that they got the legal authority to do these things more effectively and in a more routine manner. So what's new? Just to be more specific with the Model Additional Protocol, it covers all parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, everything from mining to the milling of uranium, to all the way through decommissioning facilities and final material disposal. It's much more broad. There's a new kind of access, right? Because under comprehensive safeguards agreements, there's design information verification, and there are different kinds of inspections. Complementary access is a new kind of access provided for under the additional protocol. And it's simply more kinds of locations, more locations outside facilities. For example, locations that are involved with research and development not using nuclear material. So that's a sort of a new place the agency could go on a routine manner. And then, as I mentioned, administrative measures, inspector designation, and things like that. I want to make this point very clear. What is not new, the right to conduct unannounced inspections. You could already do that under a comprehensive safeguards agreement. The right to request access to undeclared locations. The agency can already do that under a comprehensive safeguards agreement. And the right to verify both correctness and completeness. Why do I make such a point of saying this a couple of times? Because you still hear people who do not know the history cast doubt on the agency's right to do these things under a comprehensive safeguards agreement alone. So point these things out in meetings, and people will look at you like, you know, you're the smartest person in the room. So in practice, what does an AP mean for you, for your country? You send annual declarations on, you know, a variety of things. It's more work, yeah, but you know, they are simply declarations, and then you have these complementary access visits to additional locations. To give you a scale, last year the IAEA conducted 136 complementary access visits in 39 countries. And there's a report called the Safeguards Implementation Report that, you know, any of your colleagues who are working here in Vienna will have access to. Get them to send it to you. It's about 150-page document, so have fun. But it's full of good information. So okay, that was the 1990s. 1997 is when the Model Additional Protocol was approved by the Board of Governors, and some stuff has happened since then. So there was this immediate understanding in the 1990s that as the Model Additional Protocol was being developed, that you didn't want to have a comprehensive safeguards agreement and the measures under a comprehensive safeguards agreement and additional protocol just stacked on top of each other. You really want to integrate them, right? Primarily, this was driven by the need for efficiency. If you will, making sure you get the most for your money on safeguards implementation, but also that they remain effective, so that the sort of international community can assure itself that both your declarations are correct and complete. You're not doing anything you're not supposed to be doing with nuclear material. And this is where this sort of state level, this holistic view of safeguards came. This started in the late 1990s and early 2000s with what became known as integrated safeguards. This is, again, just an efficiency measure to look at a state as a whole. Mid-2000s, we start calling it the state level concept. The state level concept is simply a concept. It is the idea of utilizing all safeguards relevant information about the state when planning for, implementing, and evaluating safeguards. Every one of your countries has a state level approach. Confusing terminology, I know. A state level approach is your country's plan, rather the IAEA's plan for safeguards implementation in an individual country. So state level concept is the idea. State level approach is an individual plan for a country. These are updated once a year. This can get much more into the weeds, but you know, that's kind of how safeguards work today. I mentioned we're going to come back to small quantities protocols. I mentioned that once in the early days, once a country had one, there was no way to verify that the country continued to qualify. 2005, we're on the tail end of strengthening safeguards. And the IAEA has already been thinking for some years that this is a bit of a weakness in the safeguard system. So they come to the Board of Governors and they say, dear board, we have three options. The weakness on small quantities protocols is that we can't actually verify that you keep qualifying for one. So we can either leave them exactly how they are, and the Secretariat did not like that idea. We can either get rid of them altogether, and the member states, particularly developing countries, did not like that idea either. Or we could revise the text. And that's what they did. So they revised the text, the board approves it, and basically this makes small quantities protocols more difficult to qualify for, and they're non-operational much earlier. You cannot have any plans to have a nuclear facility in order to qualify for a small quantities protocol under the new model. And the second you announce the plan to construct a facility or you begin construction of that facility, the protocol is non-operational. The issue here is that the agency cannot just do this unilaterally, right? So they asked all of the countries with operational small quantities protocols to either amend their SQP to the new model if they still qualified, or rescind it to basically get rid of it if they did not still qualify. For the most part, this has come to pass. There are still some standouts, and mostly this has to do with capacity issues rather than anything that's actually sort of nefarious. In terms of other recent developments, you all are watching the news, I am sure. We're living in an increasingly politicized world, and that is touching Vienna as well. Board meetings, and there's one going on right now, often go into night sessions. I think of a great quote from the Austrian historian Elisabeth Röhlich, who makes an observation in her book, Inspectors for Peace, that merely the accusation of politicizing the agency is politicizing the agency. And that kind of thing is happening more and more and more. Regional issues are rising in prominence. You may have noticed that there is a war in Ukraine. You may have noticed that there is a war in Iran. You may have noticed that in both cases, attacks on nuclear facilities have unfortunately become more and more prominent, more and more common. QR code on your screen is a publication that I wrote last year about this. It's more on the sort of legal side, but these things, it's not as though this is new, but it's rising in prominence as well. Meanwhile, the IAEA, like any organization, has a budget. And for a lot of years after the NPT came into force, because the IAEA had such a higher demand placed on it for safeguards, its budget increased commensurately. Around the 1980s, member states started to say, sorry, but you need to cap this. We would like a zero real growth budget, meaning that the budget increases from year to year to account for inflation, but it doesn't increase otherwise. So they more or less did that for some time until last year when there was insistence on a zero nominal growth budget, meaning no more money at all. Now, this is a problem when you think about the increasing demand on the agency's services because more countries are interested in getting into the nuclear energy game with the same amount of money to apply safeguards. And there's going to come a point where the agency, the effectiveness of safeguards suffers, right? And sort of on that note, new and emerging technologies. So you've got these new reactors, small modular reactors that there's all this hope about, making nuclear energy more accessible to countries with smaller energy grids, or countries that can't pay for a gigantic, industrial scale nuclear reactor, but could maybe pay for something smaller, or deployed in locations that you hadn't thought about deploying a reactor before, like mines and so on. That's great. You also have artificial intelligence. You have 3D printing. You have a whole swath of other technologies that may provide opportunities for safeguards, but may make things a little bit more complicated. So this is some of the recent stuff. I think I'm close-ish to my time, so I want to say a few things that I think are applicable for the region. The first is about the model additional protocol. So remember, 1990s, we are negotiating the Model AP, and there was a drive from some countries to try to make this mandatory. And it very quickly became obvious that the AP would never be approved by the board if we tried to do that. So it's voluntary. It is absolutely, positively, 100% voluntary. There are some countries who want to call a comprehensive safeguards agreement and an additional protocol the modern standard for safeguards for nuclear verification. I tend to like that approach. There are countries who do not like that approach at all. That is a matter of national policy. There are some countries in Latin America and the Caribbean who absolutely bristle at the idea of even implying that the additional protocol is mandatory. And that does play into politics in the NPT review cycle, in the IAEA's annual general conference. And this is just something to be aware of. This is a debate. I mentioned we've got the revised text for small quantities protocols. Well, the Director General now has done a very good job of outreach to countries with outdated small quantities protocols and trying to convince them to adopt the new model. And there are still some holdouts. The important thing to say here is last year or the year before, I think, the Director General announced that, I think it was 2 years ago, either last year or the year before, announced that the agency would no longer be in a position to draw safeguards conclusions for countries with outdated small quantities protocols. There aren't many of them left, but there are a few in your region, and it's something to be aware of. There is lots of debate in Vienna in particular about the balance between the IAEA's so-called regulatory activities. This is safeguards, this is nuclear security, this is nuclear safety, as opposed to the so-called promotional activities. This is technical cooperation, nuclear energy, nuclear applications. It's, again, I'm just flagging this because this is a debate to be aware of. Particularly developing countries are insistent that this balance be maintained. And the perception that I have heard is that the developed countries are much more, pushing the regulatory stuff. That is a debate that is had in Vienna, and again, a matter of national policy. Playing out in somewhat dramatic fashion sometimes is the debate around naval nuclear propulsion. So at least 2 countries that are non-nuclear weapon states have naval nuclear propulsion programs. One, as you will, I'm sure know, is Australia through the AUKUS partnership. And of course, in Latin America is Brazil. I could do an entirely separate talk on naval nuclear propulsion, but suffice it to say, these boats, these submarines, are driven by nuclear reactors. They do not have nuclear weapons on them in Australia and Brazil's case. But the agency has to have a special arrangement with non-nuclear weapon states, a special safeguards arrangement for these countries for the submarine. This is nuclear material that is in a submarine. The agency is not going to be able to touch it for a while. There is no country that has this arrangement yet. Both Australia and Brazil are negotiating their arrangements with the IAEA, and once they are ready, whatever that ends up meaning, they will be presented to the board for, and this is a quote, appropriate action. What is appropriate action? Is it approval by the board? Is it something else? This is yet to be seen, but it's an issue to watch. The last thing to say, and this probably will not be news to any of you, but remember that language from the Tlatelolco Treaty, multilateral arrangements. It's also present in the IAEA statute. The best example of this I can think of is ABAC, the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Material. This is a complementary arrangement to IAEA safeguards. Both Brazil and Argentina inspect each other's nuclear facilities, and the IAEA also does this. this is an additional confidence building measure. This is sort of an even stronger arrangement for verification that, some refer to as equivalent to an additional protocol. I am sorry, Brazil and Argentina, it is not, but it is a good thing. And I have encouraged other regions to look into this model as well. So the last thing is just, I looked up all of your comprehensive safeguards agreements, small quantities protocols, and additional protocols. This is all public information. If you Google IAEA status of safeguards agreements, the IAEA has a very long PDF that details all of this. And all of your agreements look basically the same, with the exception of the Brazilian-Argentine quadripartite agreement that includes ABAC and the IAEA. Substantively, it's still the same. There's one article that's missing, and it's one that it doesn't make a substantive difference in the implementation of safeguards. One very last thing to say, because as I understand, the Organization of American States also includes Canada and the United States. The US is here it has a category under comprehensive safeguards agreement. The US does not have a comprehensive safeguards agreement because the nuclear weapon states are not required to accept safeguards. Instead, all of the nuclear weapon states have accepted what are called voluntary offer agreements. Basically, the 5 nuclear weapon states will give the IAEA a list of facilities that they are allowed to go to, and the IAEA can go or not go to them. It basically is a way of, sharing the burden. We're all in this together, High School Musical style. But that's why that's there. So that's me. I hope that this was interesting and that I didn't, get too into the weeds, but I'm happy in the time remaining to answer any questions that there are.
Muchas gracias, Noah, por la presentación. La verdad que muy reveladora, comprender la importancia de las salvaguardias nucleares como mecanismo de verificación, su relación con el Tratado de No Proliferación, el Tratado de Tlatelolco, el papel del OIEA en estos instrumentos para la región es esencial. Tenemos unas cuantas preguntas. Creo que nos da tiempo para responderlas. Si los participantes quisieran preguntar además, pueden hacerlo a través del espacio de Q&A y nosotros podemos irlas respondiendo. Una de las preguntas que está en el chat es para ti. Dice, how is the IAEA adapting traditional safeguards originally designed for large state-owned facilities to effectively monitor the rise of private actors, small modular reactors, and decentralized supply chains?
That is an excellent question. Yeah. And the problem with the challenge here is that many developers of small modular reactors are located in nuclear weapon states, which, as I just mentioned, are not required to accept safeguards. Many of these developers are also private industry rather than state-owned corporations. This becomes problematic at the point at which these reactors are exported to non-nuclear weapon states, because many of these reactors are envisaged to be what are they called? Sealed reactors. So you build the thing, you glue the nuclear material into the core, seal it shut, and then you export it. For the non-nuclear weapon state to use these reactors, of course, the agency is going to have to come do design information verification. We'll have to do inspection. So what the agency is doing is promoting, among other things, is promoting the concept of safeguards by design. And all safeguards by design is the practice of considering safeguards requirements from every phase of the engineering design process, everything from preconceptual phase all the way through operation and decommission. The difficulty there is it's not a legal requirement, and nobody is trying to make it a legal requirement. But the agency is having trouble getting to industry to tell them why this is important. And the reason it's important for industry is because if they don't do this, they're going to have to do retrofits on the reactor, and it's going to cost more, and it's going to take longer. And so communication on this is something that is a struggle, but that's one way the agency is addressing this. And the other way that the agency is addressing this is through further development, through standardization of procedures under the state evaluation process. So that's what they refer to, the process of coming up with these state level approaches. And there's a whole methodology there. Standardizing this, making sure that acquisition path analysis is implemented for all states. That's this methodology of identifying every pathway in a state where nuclear material could be diverted from peaceful uses. And if you can do that in a systematic way, things can become more efficient. But ultimately, most of these reactors are traditional, the ones that will be deployed are traditional light water reactor designs. The agency knows how to verify these things very well. It's just a matter of getting industry, end users, licensing officials, and the IAEA to be able to really talk to each other about what the requirements are, and the agency is on that work.
Thank you, Noah. There's another question here in the chat. It says, are there any limitations on nuclear trade for those countries that have not adhered to the additional protocol?
Not as such. So the agency does not get into export controls. That is not what the agency does, and that is not what the member states want the agency to do. The really where you're looking at there is the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which, fun fact, is 11 floors above me. It's where they have their meetings. So in terms of the export of nuclear technology, the first thing to say is you have to have a comprehensive safeguard agreement if you're getting stuff from a Nuclear Suppliers Group country. I believe, and you would have to check me on this, I believe for enrichment and reprocessing, you would have to have an additional protocol, or there's this vague language about an equivalent arrangement, something to that effect. But like in practice, it's an additional protocol for now, right? And this is the third point that I should make, is this is a decision that is influenced by the Nuclear Suppliers Group guidelines, but it's a sovereign decision. If one country wants to export, nuclear technology to another, I mean, that is that country's decision. But it's certainly not a question for the IAEA. What becomes a question for the IAEA is when that technology is exported, if we're talking about a research reactor or a power reactor or even an enrichment or reprocessing facility, whatever, the agency will, of course, have to know about it. And this will affect how the agency updates the state level approach for that country. Not to punish the country, far from it. But if there's a new facility, what is the frequency of inspections that is deemed appropriate for that kind of facility? What other information do we know about the country that influences the kinds of safeguard activities that will need to be implemented? It's simply making sure the plan stays up to date. But export controls, once again, the IAEA does not touch.
Gracias, Noah. Creo que por ahora estamos bien de tiempo. Quisiera agradecer al señor Noah por su presentación y por acercarnos a este tema para la región, que es muy importante. Creo que por ahora vamos a concluir ya la sesión. Esperamos que haya contribuido a fortalecer la comprensión sobre el papel de las salvaguardias nucleares en la arquitectura internacional de la no proliferación y su relevancia para la región, especialmente para aquellos países que están interesados en desarrollar programas de energía nuclear. Desde la sección del desarme y la no proliferación del CICTE, les reiteramos nuestro compromiso en continuar promoviendo espacios de diálogo, de cooperación, de asistencia técnica en temas vinculados a la no proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva y de seguridad internacional. Los invitamos a acercarse a nuestra página web donde podrán leer más sobre nuestros programas y nuestras iniciativas actuales. Estaremos publicando la presentación, así como un breve resumen de esta sesión en nuestra página web. Les agradezco a todos por su atención y por su tiempo y les deseamos un excelente día. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for your attention and Daniela for the invitation. Daniela has my email address, so if anyone has any